I ask you, to what end? Dread it, run from it, destiny arrives all the same. And now it's here. Or should I say, I am.
This video is about the progress of history, the second pillar of what can be broadly called the leftist worldview. We often hear or use the word progress. Most people use it to describe the attitude they hold without considering its meaning carefully. At the most basic level, progressive means developing in successive stages. As an attitude, it broadly means favoring change. I think that in this simple formulation lie several often overlooked assumptions. First, because of course the future will arrive in its own time whether we like it or not, progressive indicates that when it comes, it will be better for us if we organize ourselves according to a specific vision. Progressive is therefore a value judgment, not an objective statement. It is a moral judgment that presumes only some propositions will make society better. For example, we can find claims that the Hammurabi Code from 4,000 years ago is progressive just because it involves propositions like minimum wages that are in line with a specific moral profile. Also, because this judgment is made before the future arrives and before we can evaluate its results, value judgments are further confused with objective statements. This means that no one can be progressive. One can only hope to achieve this result. At the same time, this position attempts to claim moral authority and assert its uniqueness. If its specific sentiments are deemed progressive, how should we consider all the others? Regressive? If we accept that all people propose ideas they believe will enhance our lives, why are only some considered progressive? By default, being labeled progressive implies that all other propositions won't improve the future as effectively. Secondly, progressivism often implies change. To my previous point, you might argue that while many people have propositions, only some advocate for change. However, change is not synonymous with improvement. The vital distinction is what takes priority, the need for change or the need for a solution. The former requires negating the status quo, while the latter demands an understanding of the problem and the competence to address it. Even if a problem exists, and you lack a solution, change alone won't improve things. A careless interpretation of what progress implies can easily blur the lines, leading people to oppose the current state of affairs simply because it's flawed rather than genuinely contributing to its improvement. Thirdly, the overlap between progressive and what is new sometimes leads to the misconception that being progressive means following science. However, science is primarily concerned with truth and what is most fitting, not simply embracing novelty for its own sake. While it's true that science often introduces new concepts, it does so as a result of a deeper understanding of the subject matter, rather than blindly promoting something different from established knowledge. Additionally, because science deals with what is true, it doesn't dictate what ought to be. It provides knowledge and tools, leaving it up to us to use them wisely. For instance, we could scientifically control natural selection and experiment with eugenics, but that in no way means we should. The point of this video is to show that behind the term progressive lie assumptions that are frequently overlooked. Furthermore, the rest of the video goes into the fact that behind these assumptions, there is a theory that guides and uses those assumptions to its own ends. There are people who are resentful of what is and insist that the highest form of scientific thinking should involve negating the existing state of affairs. They believe that their moral sensibilities are superior to those of others, and that this belief represents not just a sentiment but a higher truth that everyone should adopt. They have formulated a theory that purports to be a comprehensive science of history, human development, and the purpose of our species. My first video was about this theory, dialectic, a method that, in the 19th century, was taken from its appropriate domain and used by philosophers with mystical assumptions to construct an entire worldview founded on an alternative, fluid, and linguistic logic. This theory put forward a method for framing the perpetual process of change in the world. Despite its challenge to the natural laws of reality, it was legitimized through philosophical departments as true science and swiftly permeated social scholarship and political thought. Dialectic is the study of the unity of opposites. This unification represents a progression that transforms states from a lower, divided plane to a higher, united one. Dialectic views the present state as a lower, flawed reflection of an ultimate dimension. In the lower stage, divisions and existing distinctions alienate us from the pure unified state. Dialectic traces the transformation through subsequent stages, progressing toward the ultimate unification. The entire progress of history is a journey in which the ultimate purified entity will be recompleted. The engine driving this process is negation. Negation reveals the inadequacy of what already exists, exerting purifying pressure on the lower material until it yields, transforms, and uncovers its hidden pure essence. This process is akin to the alchemical transformation of base metals into gold. Dialecticians believe that all of reality adhered to this logic. They thought that by using this method, they could not only comprehend the entirety of reality, but also access higher knowledge regarding the direction and ultimate purpose of history. They believe they could perceive not just what is, but also the world's destiny to become. For them, a progressive need not necessarily understand the world dialectically. It could be someone who knows nothing about the theory yet engages in the game laid down by the theory, criticizing what is because it alienates him from what he subjectively feels he is entitled to and advocating for transformations of the world according to this vision. In this process, progressives search for societal lines dividing us and relentlessly criticize them as fundamentally and morally wrong. For instance, only after we eliminate the marginalizing distinctions of wealth between the poor and the rich, abolish white privilege dividing races, or eliminate biological distinctions of sex dividing transgender and cisgender individuals, will we have progress. As I outlined in the first episode on dialectics, this theory was recycled and readapted to remain viable after its subsequent failures. In this section, I will briefly summarize each phase in which the progressive attitude was advanced: Hegelian dialectic, Marxism, critical theory, postmodernism, and then modern critical social justice, or as we commonly know it, woke ideology. After each summary, I will provide a series of quotes to support my interpretation. The first iteration of this theory was Hegel's dialectic. Hegel developed his own logic to explain the progress of human society and history towards its ultimate culmination. Under the guise of the term dialectic, he concealed what had previously been known as mysticism and introduced it into academia as a legitimate study of history and the development of human society. His ideas drew from older perspectives such as alchemy and Prisca theologia. Drawing on the mystical aspirations of reaching a higher spiritual dimension, Hegel claimed that the purpose of history is to restore the entity from the realm of ideals, pure freedom. He argued that pure absolute consciousness strives to manifest its own perfection in the practical world. To him, history was a process of reconciling unfitting, imperfect contradictions, broken shards of an incomplete absolute. This ongoing process propelled us forward and elevated us from an imperfect state toward the realization of ultimate unity. As he saw it, the fundamental nature of reality was a dialectic of becoming, a synthesis of nothingness and being. Hegelian system detailed the journey towards the end of history, driven by negation. It entailed a perpetual transcendence, an escape from and purification of what exists so that it may transform into what it is destined to be. This negation, similarly to the alchemical purification of base material into higher one, like turning lead into gold. Here are a couple of quotes from Hegel that I hope capture the essence of what I have explained. The history of the world in general is the consciousness of freedom and the phases which this consciousness assumes in developing itself. History in general is therefore the development of spirit in time, as nature is the development of the idea in space. World history is not the verdict of mere might, but actualization of the universal mind. Each stage of world history is a necessary moment in the idea of the world mind. The mind of the world exercises its right in the history of the world, which is the world's court of judgment. History is mind clothing itself with the form of events or the immediate actuality of nature. The stages of its development are therefore presented as immediate natural principles. These, because they are natural, are a plurality external to one another, and they are present therefore in such a way that each of them is assigned to one nation in the external form of its geographical and anthropological conditions. Hegelian history has its own teleology, which means purpose. Much like the Christian worldview awaits a second coming of Christ and a judgment day at the end of history, Hegel crafts a similar but alternative, bastardized narrative. He too envisions a day when history will reach its conclusion. However, on this day, God does not return to judge humanity. For Hegel, history itself is the process of completing God. As humanity progresses towards the absolute, judgment is continuously passed on everyone within this process. Dialectical progress discards those forms that are unfit for elevation towards unity. These rejected forms are left behind and crushed in the mill of history. In Hegel's system, progressives are the moral agents who endorse this unceasing process of negation. They are the ones who aid the absolute in realizing itself by negating what is. Therefore, the purpose of each individual is to subordinate themselves to this process and its tangible manifestation on earth, the state. The mutations which history presents have been long characterized in the general as an advance to something better, more perfect. We have already discussed the final aim of progression. The principles of the successive phases of spirit that animate the nations in a necessitated gradation are themselves only steps in the development of the one universal spirit, which through them elevates and completes itself to a self-comprehending totality. I adhere to the view that the world spirit has given the age marching orders. These orders are being obeyed. The world spirit, this essential, proceeds irresistibly like a closely drawn armored phalanx advancing with imperceptible movement, much as the sun through thick and thin. Innumerable light troops flank it on all sides, throwing themselves into the balance for or against its progress, though most of them are entirely ignorant of what is at stake and merely take head blows as from an invisible hand. World historical actions culminate with individuals as subjects, living instruments of the world mind. A world historical individual is devoted to the one aim regardless of all else. It is even possible that such men may treat other great, even sacred interests inconsiderately, conduct which is indeed obnoxious to moral reprehension. But so mighty a form must trample down many an innocent flower or crush to pieces many an object in its path. For the history of the world occupies a higher ground than that on which morality has properly its position, which is personal character, the conscience of individuals, their particular will and mode of action. These have a value, imputation, reward, or punishment proper to themselves. What the absolute aim of spirit requires and accomplishes, what providence does, transcends the obligations and the liability to imputation and the ascription of good or bad motives which attach to individuality in virtue of its social relations. When liberty is mentioned, we must always be careful to observe whether it is not really the assertion of private interests which is thereby designated. For law is the objectivity of spirit, volition in its true form. Only that will which obeys law is free, for it obeys itself. It is independent and so free. State in and by itself is the ethical whole, the actualization of freedom. This final end has supreme right against the individual, whose supreme duty is to be a member of the state. A single person, I need hardly say, is something subordinate, and as such he must dedicate himself to the ethical whole. Hence, if the state claims life, the individual must surrender it. One must worship the state as a terrestrial divinity. When Marx adopted Hegelian theory, he shifted it from the realm of ideals to the realm of material reality. For him, it wasn't the absolute idea attempting to harmonize practical reality in its own image. Instead, it was human society crafting ever newer forms of organization and production, steadily advancing human freedom and surmounting divisions. This journey involved transcending slavery to reach feudalism, then progressing to capitalism, then socialism, and finally ascending to a higher stage of communal living. Communism, but on the higher technologically enhanced stage. Here, a new ideal human is realized, one who finally attains their destined state. Similar to Hegel in this process, The purpose of humanity is to subjugate individuality to this process and participate in the moral work of negation of the existing state of affairs. In Marx's materialistic dialectic model, progress was still driven by negation and criticism. It blurred the lines between what is genuinely new, fitting, and useful, and that which is merely different from what came before, something that merely dismantled previous categories and divisions. Examples of Marxist ideas on this topic are: communism is the riddle of history solved, and it knows itself to be this solution. The entire movement of history, as simply communism's actual act of genesis, the birth act of its empirical existence, is therefore, for its thinking consciousness, the comprehended and known process of its becoming. The whole of what is called world history is nothing but the creation of man by human labor, and the emergence of nature for man. He therefore has the evident and irrefutable proof of his self-creation, of his own origins. All history is the history of preparing and developing man to become the object of sensuous consciousness, and turning the requirements of man as man into his needs. History itself is a real part of natural history, of nature developing into man. But since for the socialist man the entire so-called history of the world is nothing but the creation of man through human labor, nothing but the emergence of nature for man, so he has the visible, irrefutable proof of his birth through himself, of his genesis. The individuals, who are no longer subject to the division of labor, have been conceived by the philosophers as an ideal under the name man. They have conceived the whole process which we have outlined as the evolutionary process of man, so that at every historical stage man was substituted for the individuals and shown as the motive force of history. The whole process was thus conceived as a process of the self-estrangement of man, and this was essentially due to the fact that the average individual of the later stage was always foisted onto the earlier stage, and the consciousness of a later age onto the individuals of an earlier. Through this inversion, which from the first is an abstract image of the actual conditions, it was possible to transform the whole of history into an evolutionary process of consciousness. The outstanding achievement of Hegel's phenomenology and of its final outcome, the dialectic of negativity as the moving and generating principle, is thus first that Hegel conceives the self-creation of man as a process, conceives objectification as loss of the object as alienation, and as transcendence of this alienation, that he thus grasps the essence of labor and comprehends objective man. True, because real man, as the outcome of man's own labor. The real, active orientation of man to himself as a species being, or his manifestation as a real species being, as a human being, is only possible if he really brings out all his species powers, something which in turn is only possible through the cooperative action of all of mankind, only as a result of history, and treats these powers as objects, and this, to begin with, is again only possible in the form of estrangement. Just as Darwin discovered the law of development or organic nature, so Marx discovered the law of development of human history, the simple fact, hitherto concealed by an overgrowth of ideology, that mankind must first of all eat, drink, have shelter and clothing, before it can pursue politics, science, art, religion, etc., that therefore the production of the immediate material means, and consequently the degree of economic development attained by a given people or during a given epoch, form the foundation upon which the state institutions, the legal conceptions, art, and even the ideas on religion of the people concerned have been evolved, and in the light of which they must, therefore, be explained instead of vice versa, as had hitherto been the case. It is, therefore, from the history of nature in human society that the laws of dialectics are abstracted, for they are nothing but the most general laws of these two aspects of historical development, as well as of thought itself. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight that each time ended either in the revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. The country that is more developed industrially only shows, to the less developed, the image of its own future. World historical existence of individuals means existence of individuals which is directly linked up with world history. History is the judge, its executioner, the proletarian. Revolutions are the locomotives of history. By heralding the dissolution of the hereto existing world order, the proletariat merely proclaims the secret of its own existence, for it is the factual dissolution of that world order. No social order is ever destroyed before all the productive forces for which it is sufficient have been developed, and new superior relations of production never replace older ones before the material conditions for their existence have matured within the framework of the old society. Mankind thus inevitably sets itself only such tasks as it is able to solve, since closer examination will always show that the problem itself arises only when the material conditions for its solution are already present, or at least in the course of formation. But the subordination must be to the armed vanguard of all the exploited, of all the toilers, to the proletariat. Measures must be taken at once, overnight, to substitute for the specific methods of official administration by state officials the simple functions of workmen and managers, functions which are already fully within the capacity of the average city dweller and can well be performed for workmen's wages. Every communist party represents a higher type of organization than every bourgeois party or opportunist workers' party, and this shows itself in the greater demands made by the party on its individual members. And the dictatorship of the proletariat, the organization of the vanguard of the oppressed as the ruling class for the purpose of suppressing the oppressors, cannot result merely in an expansion of democracy. Simultaneously with an immense expansion of democracy, which for the first time becomes democracy for the poor, democracy for the people, and not democracy for the moneybags, the dictatorship of the proletariat imposes a series of restrictions on the freedom of the oppressors, the exploiters, the capitalists. We must suppress them in order to free humanity from wage slavery. Their resistance must be crushed by force. In the decades following Marx, his theory failed to deliver what it promised. It failed to incite the expected revolution in the West. Where it did manifest, as in the case of Russia, it didn't align with the supposed law of progress. Feudal Russia experienced revolution, while more advanced nations like England or Germany remained capitalist. Furthermore, even in Russia, socialism didn't quite live up to its advertised ideals. As a result, the theory required adaptation to account for its glaring failures. Cultural Marxists and the Frankfurt School opted to move away from a purely materialistic economic interpretation and shifted the focus of their dialectical method towards culture. They began critiquing and transforming culture in their quest to liberate and progress society. Additionally, they employed a clever tactic to evade accountability for future unfulfilled predictions. They argued that the future, the higher dimension toward which we are progressing, is impossible to precisely describe using the language of the lower dimension in which we are currently confined, so they shouldn't be asked to do so. It is impossible to predict the time and progress of revolution. It is governed by its own more or less mysterious laws. What kind of life? We are still confronted with the demand to state the concrete alternative. The demand is meaningless if it asks for a blueprint of the specific institutions and relationships, which would be those of the new society. They cannot be determined a priori. They will develop in trial and error as the new society develops. The concept of the primary initial institutions of liberation is familiar enough and concrete enough. Collective ownership, collective control, and planning of the means of production and distribution. This is the foundation, a necessary but not sufficient condition for the alternative. It would make possible the usage of all available resources for the abolition of poverty, which is the prerequisite for the turn from quantity into quality, the creation of a reality in accordance with the new sensitivity and the new consciousness. This goal implies rejection of those policies of reconstruction, no matter how revolutionary, which are bound to perpetuate or to introduce the pattern of the unfree societies and their needs. Rosa Luxemburg showed convincingly that history advances dialectically, and that the internal contradictions of the capitalist system are constantly intensified, and this is so not merely in the sphere of pure economics, but also in the relations between economics and politics. The dialectical method derives all concrete determinations from one comprehensive principle, which is the principle of the actual development of the subject matter itself. The various states, qualities, and conditions of the subject matter must appear as its own positive unfolded content. Nothing can be added from outside any given fact, for instance. Dialectical development is not the external activity of subjective thought, but the objective history of the real itself. Through activity, however, the spirit has a share in the genesis, which annoys idealism as something which contaminates it. The spirit as activity is, as the philosophers keep repeating, a becoming, hence not something they put still greater stress on, chorus, Greek. Separately from history. According to its simple concept, its activity is intratemporal, historical, a becoming as well as what has become in which becoming accumulates. Progress is not a neutral term. It moves toward specific ends, and these ends are defined by the possibilities of ameliorating the human condition. Advanced industrial society is approaching the stage where continued progress would demand the radical subversion of the prevailing direction and organization of progress. This stage would be reached when material production, including the necessary services, becomes automated to the extent that all vital needs can be satisfied while necessary labor time is reduced to marginal time. From this point on, technical progress would transcend the realm of necessity, where it served as the instrument of domination and exploitation, which thereby limited its rationality. Technology would become subject to the free play of faculties in the struggle for the pacification of nature and of society. Such a state is envisioned in Marx's notion of the abolition of labor. The term pacification of existence seems better suited to designate the historical alternative of a world which, through an international conflict which transforms and pens the contradictions within the established societies, advances on the brink of a global war. Pacification of existence means the development of man's struggle with man and with nature under conditions where the competing needs, desires, and aspirations are no longer organized by vested interests in domination and scarcity, an organization which perpetuates the destructive forms of this struggle. Freedom is liberation, a specific historical process in theory and practice, and as such it has its right and wrong, its truth and falsehood. The awareness of the transcendent possibilities of freedom must become a driving power in the consciousness and the imagination which prepared the soil for this revolution. Dialectical materialism understands freedom as historical, empirical transcendence, as a force of social change, transcending its immediate form also in a socialist society, not toward ever more production, not toward heaven or paradise, but toward an ever more peaceful, joyful struggle with the inexorable resistance of society and nature. This is the philosophical core of the theory of the permanent revolution. For just as the realm of freedom cannot be given to us as a present all at once, as a gratia irresistibilis, just as the final goal is not simply waiting for us somewhere outside the process, but inheres in every particular aspect of the process, so to the Communist Party as the revolutionary form of consciousness of the proletariat is a process by nature. Cultural and Western Marxists still believe that we are in historical process of reaching some kind of purified higher and more free state of society. Even if they couldn't tell how and when we will reach it, they still relied on alchemical purification. Dialectical criticism was the engine of historical becoming. The future of humanity depends on the existence today of the critical attitude. Hegel's dialectic is permeated with the profound conviction that all immediate forms of existence in nature and history are bad because they do not permit things to be what they can be. True existence begins only when the immediate state is recognized as negative, when beings become subjects and strive to adapt their outward state to their potentialities. Spirit become compulsion. The power of that negativity rules to this day in reality. What would be different has not yet begun. This affects all specific determinations. The dialectical pattern represents, and is thus the truth of, a world permeated by negativity, a world in which everything is something other than it really is, and in which opposition and contradiction constitute the laws of progress. Negative thinking draws whatever force it may have from its empirical basis. The actual human condition in a given society, and the given possibilities to transcend this condition to enlarge the realm of freedom. In this sense, negative thinking is by virtue of its own internal concepts positive, oriented toward and comprehending a future which is contained in the present. Theory must, as a dialectical one, like the Marxist one, by far and away, be immanent, even when it ultimately negates the entire sphere in which it moves. Human history, progressive natural domination, continues the unconscious one of nature, of devouring and being devoured. Marx was ironically a social Darwinist. What the social Darwinists praised and wished to act according to is for him the negativity, in which the possibility of its sublation awakens. The dialectic follows the structural transformation of civil society to the point of its final negation. The concepts that point to this negation are at the very root of the Hegelian system. Reason and freedom, conceived as genuine dialectical concepts, cannot be fulfilled in the prevailing system of civil society. At the same time, this means that history must abolish itself. The abolition of social relationships which presently hinder development is in fact the next historical goal. But abolition is a dialectical concept. The present generation, says Marx, resembles the Jews whom Moses led through the wilderness. It must not only conquer a new world, it must also perish in order to make room for people who will be equal to a new world. As before the individual was to be entirely subordinated to this process, his individuality was considered only if it reflected the picture of the theory imagined about what humanity must become. But historical evolution annuls the autonomy of the individual factors. Above all, one thing must be made clear. Freedom here does not mean the freedom of the individual. This is not to say that the fully developed communist society will have no knowledge of the freedom of the individual. On the contrary, it will be the first society in the history of mankind that really takes this freedom seriously and actually makes it a reality. However, even this freedom will not be the same as the freedom that bourgeois ideologists have in mind today. In order to achieve the social preconditions necessary for real freedom, battles must be fought in the course of which present-day society will disappear, together with the race of men it has produced. We said then that the discipline of the Communist Party, the unconditional absorption of the total personality in the praxis of the movement, was the only possible way of bringing about an authentic freedom. And this not merely for the whole movement, which only acquires a purchase on the objective societal preconditions for this freedom by means of such an organization, but even for the single individual, for the single member of the party who by this means alone can hope to obtain freedom for himself too. If every member of the party commits his whole personality and his whole existence to the party in this way, then the same centralizing and disciplinary principle will preside over the living interaction between the will of the members and that of the party leadership, and will ensure that the will and the wishes, the proposals and the criticisms of the members are given due weight by the party leaders. Every decision of the party must result in actions by all the members of the party, and every slogan leads to deeds in which the individual members risk their whole physical and moral existence. For this very reason, they are not only well placed to offer criticism, they are forced to do so together with their experiences and their doubts. Socialist solidarity is autonomy. Self-determination begins at home, and that is with every I, and the we whom the I chooses. And this end must indeed appear in the means to attain it, that is to say, in the strategy of those who, within the existing society, work for the new one. If the socialist relationships of production are to be a new way of life, a new form of life, then their existential quality must show forth, anticipated and demonstrated, in the fight for their realization. Exploitation in all its forms must have disappeared from this fight, from the work relationships among the fighters as well as from their individual relationships. Understanding, tenderness toward each other, the instinctual consciousness of that which is evil, false, the heritage of oppression, would then testify to the authenticity of the rebellion. In order to become vehicles of freedom, science and technology would have to change their present direction and goals. They would have to be reconstructed in accord with a new sensibility, the demands of the life instincts. In the years following the Second World War, dialecticians faced a fresh series of setbacks, both on the right, where attempts to forge a historically perfect spirit of the nation by fascists failed, and on the left, following the admission by the USSR of the brutality perpetrated under Stalin's rule. In response, a new movement repurposed dialectical assumptions. Postmodernists, however, no longer held faith in the dialectical final aim or any ultimate purpose in truth. In fact, they rejected the very notion of truth itself, seeing it as nothing more than an imposed claim by those in power. Without a stable reference to truth, the web of social relations ceased to be a rigid spiral leading us progressively closer to an ultimate goal. While postmodernists could no longer defend dialectics, they still sought to salvage as much of Marx as possible. They hadn't abandoned their belief in the power of negation, but rebranded it as deconstruction. Previously, negation or criticism had served as an engine of progress, purifying and improving society, molding it into a better form until it reached its supposed true state. For postmodernists, truth was now considered merely a power game that estranged us from the authenticity of subjective selves. Deconstruction, therefore, functioned more like an acid dissolving structures of oppression, liberating oppressed subjectivities from regimes of truth and normalcy. While postmodernists couldn't enforce their moral vision, they still believed that something new, if seen as something negating, something other to what already is, was desirable. Freeing subjectivities became a matter not of constructing something according to the vision, but of destroying any objective claim. Progress moved closer to seeking justice, dismantling what hindered subjectivity. This epistemological mutation of history is not yet complete, but it is not of recent origin either, since its first phase can no doubt be traced back to Marx. Deconstruction has never had any sense or interest, in my view at least, except as a radicalization, which is to say also in the tradition of a certain Marxism and a certain spirit of Marxism. There has been then this attempted radicalization of Marxism called deconstruction in the opposite direction. It seeks rather to untie all those knots that historians have patiently tied. It increases differences, blurs the lines of communication, and tries to make it more difficult to pass from one thing to another, in contrast to the various projects which aim to inscribe knowledges in the hierarchical order of power associated with science. A genealogy should be seen as a kind of attempt to emancipate historical knowledges from that subjection, to render them, that is, capable of opposition and of struggle against the coercion of a theoretical, unitary, formal, and scientific discourse. It's not a matter of emancipating truth from every system of power, which would be a chimera, for truth is already power, but of detaching the power of truth from the forms of hegemony, social, economic, and cultural, within which it operates at the present time. Against this hegemony of the system, one can exalt the ruses of desire, practice revolutionary micrology of the quotidian, exalt the molecular drift, or even defend cooking. This does not resolve the imperious necessity of checking the system in broad daylight. This only terrorism can do. This is a history, and a history, as such, can be deconstructed. Each time you replace one legal system by another one law by another one, or you improve the law, that is a kind of deconstruction, a critique and deconstruction. So the law as such can be deconstructed and has to be deconstructed. That is the condition of historicity, revolution, morals, ethics, and progress. But justice is not the law. Justice is what gives us the impulse, the drive, or the movement to improve the law, that is, to deconstruct the law. Without a call for justice, we would not have any interest in deconstructing the law. That is why I said that the condition of possibility of deconstruction is a call for justice. Justice is not reducible to the law, to a given system of legal structures. That means that justice is always unequal to itself. It is non-coincident with itself. Maybe the target nowadays is not to discover what we are, but to refuse what we are. Starting in the 1980s and gaining prominence in broader society in the 2000s, scholars and activists adopted two approaches that could fuel and legitimize progressive politics: the critical and deconstructionist approaches. As I mentioned earlier, the critical approach remains steadfast in its belief in ultimate truth, and consequently, assumes it comprehends the purpose of history. This leads to a moral obligation to impose this understanding on others. Critics will therefore negate, criticize, and accuse anything that doesn't align with their worldview, with the goal of revolutionizing or transforming the social order in favor of those they deem oppressed. They claim a moral high ground that presupposes entitlement, and if realized would grant authority, status, and resources to progressives. In practical terms, critical progressives are exemplified by movements like decolonization, anti-racist critical pedagogy, or radical feminism. They argue that because our society is oppressive, certain races or sexes possess higher knowledge due to their lived experience of oppression. Consequently, they believe they are entitled to reparations, redistribution, affirmative action, and insist that other groups must acknowledge their privilege and repent by deferring to the oppressed. On the other hand, postmodern deconstruction does not believe in ultimate or even any real truth. Postmodernism leverages moral indignation to dismantle authority. If no one has authority, then no moral norms can be imposed by progressives. In the postmodern version, progress is about freeing oneself and escaping the authority of truth, norms, and institutions. Progressives who embrace postmodernism, such as proponents of queer theory or fat studies, argue that because there is no absolute truth, we should negate and deconstruct norms related to sexuality or fitness. Progress in this context means ending the punishment or exclusion of sexual deviancy, blurring age barriers for sexual acts, or abolishing beliefs about standards of beauty, physical health, and fitness. When there is no one left to pass judgment, we will be liberated from oppressive norms imposed upon us. Here are some quotes from critical approaches like feminism, pedagogy, and critical race theory that illustrate mentioned beliefs. We are surrounded by racial inequity, as visible as the law, as hidden as our private thoughts. The question for each of us is, what side of history will we stand on? A racist is someone who is supporting a racist policy by their actions or inaction, or expressing a racist idea. Incorrect conceptions of race as a social construct, as opposed to a power construct, of racial history as a singular march of racial progress, as opposed to a duel of anti-racist and racist progress, of the race problem as rooted in ignorance and hate, as opposed to powerful self-interest, all come together to produce solutions bound to fail. This very ambivalence of the other, of the female, will be reflected in the rest of her history. Until our time she will be subordinated to men's will. But this will is ambiguous. By total annexation, woman will be lowered to the rank of a thing. Of course, man attempts to cover with his own dignity what he conquers and possesses. In his eyes, the other retains some of her primitive magic. One of the problems he will seek to solve is how to make his wife both a servant and a companion. His attitude will evolve throughout the centuries, and this will also entail an evolution in woman's destiny. To live according to the feminine mystique depends on a reversal of history, a devaluation of human progress. To get women back into the home again, not like the Nazis by ordering them there, but by propaganda with a view to restoring woman's sense of prestige and self-esteem as women, actual or potential mothers. Women who live as women meant that women had to resist their own technological unemployment. The changes necessary to bring about that equality were, and still are, very revolutionary indeed. They involve a sex role revolution for men and women which will restructure all our institutions: child rearing, education, marriage, the family, the architecture of the home, the practice of medicine, work, politics, the economy, religion, psychological theory, human sexuality, morality, and the very evolution of the race. A reign of undisturbed peace is unthinkable in history. History is becoming, it is human event. But rather than feeling disappointed and frightened by critical discovery of the tension in which my humanity places me, I discovered in that tension the joy of being. Because men are historical beings, incomplete and conscious of being incomplete, revolution is as natural and permanent human dimension as is education. To say the word is to make history that can be made and remade. The dominated and silenced classes can only say the word when they take history into their own hands and dismantle the oppressive system that crushes them. Through revolutionary praxis, along with a critical and vigilant leadership, the dominated classes learn to proclaim their world, thus discovering the real reasons for their past silence. They students now see that reality, a process and not a static fact, is full of contradictions, and that social conflicts are not metaphysical categories but rather historical expressions of the confrontation of these contradictions. Any attempt, therefore, to solve conflict without touching the contradictions that have generated it only stifles the conflict and at the same time strengthens the ruling class. The prophetic position demands a critical analysis of the social structures in which the conflict takes place. This means that it demands of its followers a knowledge of socio-political science, since this science cannot be neutral. This demands an ideological choice. That is why their hope rests not in an invitation to halt the pilgrimage, an invitation offered not only by the traditionalists, but also by the alienating modernizers. Their hope lies in the call forward march, not the senseless wandering of those who give up and run, but the forward march of those who hold history in their hands, who create it and recreate themselves in it. It is the forward march they will eventually have to embark upon if they are to experience death as an oppressed class and be born again to liberation. These were quotes about progressivism with more critical tilt. Here are some examples of progressive thinking built on postmodern ideas. The juridical structures of language and politics constitute the contemporary field of power. Hence, there is no position outside this field, but only a critical genealogy of its own legitimating practices. As such, the critical point of departure is the historical present, as Marx put it, and the task is to formulate within this constituted frame a critique of the categories of identity that contemporary juridical structures engender, naturalize, and immobilize. Forces and impulses with multiple directionalities are precisely that which history both destroys and preserves through the instown, historical event of inscription. As a volume in perpetual disintegration, the body is always under siege, suffering destruction by the very terms of history. And history is the creation of values and meanings by a signifying practice that requires the subjection of the body. This corporeal destruction is necessary to produce the speaking subject and its significations. This is a body, described through the language of surface and force, weakened through a single drama of domination, inscription, and creation. This is not the modus vivendi of one kind of history rather than another, but is, for Foucault, history in its essential and repressive gesture. If we accept Foucault's framework, we are compelled to redescribe the maternal libidinal economy as a product of an historically specific organization of sexuality. Moreover, the discourse of sexuality, itself suffused by power relations, becomes the true ground of the trope of the prediscursive maternal body. The queerness of which I speak would deliberately sever us from ourselves, from the assurance, that is, of knowing ourselves and hence of knowing our good. Such queerness proposes, in place of the good, something I want to call better, though it promises in more than one sense of the phrase, absolutely nothing. Drag differs from other forms of gendered performance in its tendency to mock authority and challenge the status quo. While drag has some conventions, it ultimately has no rules. Its defining quality is often to break as many rules as possible. Similarly, many campy drag aesthetics like parody and exaggeration to stigmatize shame by placing the joke on society rather than individuals, further revealing to kids that ideas of appropriateness are subject to change. Strategy of equivocation does not focus on social identities, but on practices, processes, as well as relations of power, knowledge, and truth. Foucault. It tries to subvert those mechanisms that secure the working of a normative heterosexual gender order or any other order which seems to be natural or unquestionable. It intervenes regimes of normality and processes of normalization by revealing ambiguity where a single truth is claimed, where a clear line is drawn, or an entity is stabilized. It functions as an answer to the critique of identity politics as intervenes in the principle of identity. Therefore, a queer strategy of equivocation favors representations and practices, which resist being pinned down to a single meaning, but materialize the processes of the construction of realities and the conditions of power at work in these processes. Queerness is not yet here. Queerness is an ideality. Put another way, we are not yet queer. We may never touch queerness, but we can feel it as the warm illumination of a horizon imbued with potentiality. We have never been queer, yet queerness exists for us as an ideality that can be distilled from the past and used to imagine a future. The future is queerness's domain. Queerness is a structuring and educated mode of desiring that allows us to see and feel beyond the quagmire of the present. The here and now is a prison house. To me, the term progressive has become a broken word. In this video, I've tried to illustrate that what falls under the broad umbrella of progressivism carries very specific assumptions. These assumptions about progress often masquerade as objective facts, but are, in fact, assert moral vision and authority. They blur the distinction between things that are genuinely new and better and the act of negating current solutions for the sake of something different from what already exists. I've tried to demonstrate that academia has constructed an entire logic and worldview that promotes these assumptions. Normally, we might consider these assumptions to be overinterpretations or errors, but the theory is designed to guide us precisely to these mistaken conclusions. If one isn't cautious, they can be pulled towards these interpretations. What is concerning is that current institutions have made little to no effort to put brakes and checks to prevent these manipulations and abuses. This is because these assumptions are features, not bugs, of the theory. Let's consider an example. J.K. Rowling, for many years, was regarded as a progressive champion for feminist issues. As long as she advocated for change and criticized gender-related problems, she was celebrated as a hero and a forward thinker. However, as soon as she stated that certain boundaries should not be crossed, certain categories should not be disregarded, she was labeled regressive, exclusionary, and against progress. Her views hadn't changed, but a new stage of the theory had arrived. When conflicting opinions clashed, the theory, which no one involved knew about, arbitrated who was progressive. Consequently, institutions began treating her as persona non grata. The crime she committed revolved precisely around what I believe progressive means today. Someone with a moral vision that necessitated negating and deconstructing certain categories, in this case, the category of sex. When she refused, she was condemned. Because J.K. Rowling is immensely influential, activists and institutions couldn't simply cancel her. She still believes that her understanding of progressivism is more accurate. Yes, there are alternative interpretations of the word, but maintaining one's stance, asserting their own interpretation as valid, and withstanding the pressure from institutions and broader society demands a tremendous amount of wealth, power, and character, much like in the case of J.K. Rowling. Normal people who aspire to be progressive, driven by their indignation about societal problems and a belief in their own morality because they seek change, unknowingly find themselves overshadowed and manipulated by theorists who imagine they perceive the direction of history. These theorists believe that all of existence should bend toward realizing their moral vision, seeing this impulse as the highest form of truth. They will promote individuals who are prepared, at any given moment, to criticize the existing order, discarding them as soon as those people reach any line that is too much to cross for them. As long as these individuals remain useful, they will be granted the moral license of being progressive, and as soon as they cease to be useful, this license is revoked. Additionally, because the theory extends a protective umbrella and the authority of science and institutions, it goes unexamined. It becomes astonishingly easy to hide resentment and hostility while camouflaging it as scientific valid proposal for improvement. Until we grapple with this theory, those genuinely seeking solutions will find themselves in the same boat as hostile arsonists who claim that destruction is an act of unity and healing. As long as dialectic and postmodern discourses are permitted to reign in academia and other institutions, we will be manipulated by self-anointed individuals hiding behind the most boring books in the dullest libraries. If we don't challenge these moral and social alchemists, we will be left in a sea of ashes, searching for the promised seeds of gold.
I am inevitable.